今天我们很高兴邀请到美国科罗拉多大学在波德的这个校区的Professor Hertzberg，他是机械系的教授，但是大家可能会觉得有点奇怪，为什么我们找个机械系老师来讲这个题目？但是因为大概10几年前，我在美国参加流体力学的一个学术研讨会的时候，在那边看到一个特别的 session 在专门讲教育，然后被他的题目吸引了。那他那时候就已经开始在讲，等一下他会跟我们分享这个课程，他在教这个跨领域的工程的流体力学方面的美学，而且跟校内另外一个系的老师合作。那这10几年下来，他继续把他的课一直演化，然后这个研究也开始进行。所以我想说这一次我们很高兴可以请到他来跟我们分享一下这方面的经验啊，还有一些未来可能可以做的事情。那么他有特别提到说，他很期待能够跟我们这边的老师合作，如果有哪位老师有兴趣做这种跨域教学的跨国比较研究的话，好，那因为他首先要也蛮寂寞的，不管在东学还是在其他地方做这种跨域教学，就已经很少人了。然后他说这个从我那次听他那个演讲之后到现在，那时候只有他开这样一门课，到现在10几年，他在美国好像看到有另外3个老师开这样的课而已，这样非常少。所以他就是开这样的课已经很少了，那么还要再做这个教学研究的，那就更少。那所以我想，如果各位老师听一听他做的事情，那如果觉得有兴趣可以相互比较的话，那不管是跟我们计划办公室、子计划办公室，还是受辅助团队的老师们，都欢迎，因为可以做不同的互相合作的研究。所以这个部分就是在今天的交流，那他明天也有可能会来继续参加听大家的这个，因为我们这次邀请了2位外国讲者，他们就是我们本来邀他2天的专题演讲，但是他们看到我们整个agenda 之后，都说要全程参加的，那表示可能对各位要做的事情都非常有兴趣，但我们也有那个工作也会稍微帮他翻译一下，那所以像我们的交流可能大部分还是用中文进行。不过就是说，很欢迎大家在中间空档的时间，想一想，有什么可以跟他交流、可以合作的，就可以跟他讨论一下这样子。那么我再介绍一下他这方面的背景。他其实有点家学渊源，他的父亲是华盛顿大学的航太系的教授，所以他在西雅图长大，然后到密西根大学念大学部。然后再到伯克莱念 PhD， 然后现在一路都是学流体力学了但是呢，你大家就会看到他从另外一个角度来看，跟我们传统在看理工科学习是不太一样的。那昨天有几位朋友今天来听他比较针对工学院老师或者说理工科老师的角度来看这个事情。那么我们本来用意是说各位的团队里面可能会邀请到一些理工科老师来跟你们搭配研究，那么他们可能会想说，那到底要怎么做比较好？那么从他们角度来做那么如果他们今天没办法出席，昨天没办法出席的话，没关系，各位今天听一听可以回去转达一下，或者你们也比较知道怎么跟这些理工科老师沟通这样的事情。虽然从他们经验来看，好像也不是很容易但是毕竟有走在比较前面的经验这样子。好，那so it's about time for the speech.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and let's welcome Professor.
Thank you. When I was invited to come here to speak to you, I was told that I would have one audience yesterday and a different audience today, but I see many faces in the audience who were here yesterday, so I want to apologize to you. The talk is very much the same, except for a couple of discussion questions. So I'm going to be asking you to talk to each other to process some of this information and for me to learn more about you. So I'm going to be talking about teaching engineering and art, but really about teaching art and engineering. So here is an outline of my talk. I will give some definitions of art and aesthetics, although I think can I see who is in the audience? How many of you are engineering professors or teach a STEM topic, chemistry, or? Nobody, okay, cool. All right. How about any in the fine arts? Any fine arts professors here today? Okay. Social science? Almost all social science. Okay. Psychology? Okay. And humanities? Okay. All right. Mostly social sciences. Okay. Great. So I will give some definitions of art and aesthetics, and maybe we can talk about what kind of aesthetics exist in your discipline in social sciences. I'll give a little bit of context in terms of what we call C.P. Snow's divide, the division of two cultures in our society today. Give an example of one of the courses I teach, which is flow visualization, and show you what kind of aesthetics exist in this very technical area. Two stories, one from Mark Twain and one from Richard Feynman. And I learned yesterday that probably many of you have heard of these stories in the past. I will talk a little bit about some results from engineering education research. Do we have any education researchers here today? No? Okay. Yes? Great. What we call the transformative experience and what that can do for our students. Give another example of a course on the aesthetics of design. Again, a technical area, but has very important aesthetics in it. And then some results from educational research in terms of what is a growth mindset, how that can help our students develop not just their disciplinary identity, their identity as engineers, but also their identity in other areas, and not lose that as they develop. Okay, so engineering identity. So this is from my perspective, not knowing very much about Taiwanese culture at all. In the West, we talk about how science was once art. They were the same. Everything that humans did was considered an art. Along comes the early university structure 500-600 years ago, when liberal arts were defined. So the original liberal arts were grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And these, in yellow, we now recognize not as liberal arts, but as sciences of various types, all right? So, but initially that was considered the liberal arts. Along comes the 18th century, when fine arts was defined and invented, along with the idea of art critics. So painting and sculpture, architecture, music, and poetry were defined as fine arts, primarily done for aesthetic purposes. And a lot of the other endeavors, the things we now call STEM topics, science, technology, engineering, and math, they were excluded from being art, okay? Humanities and arts were similarly excluded from anything in the sciences. And in fact, some of these arts were demoted to being just crafts, as if there was a combination of function and decoration, for example. These were crafts often done by women, so cooking, needlework, interior decoration of the home. These lost status, actually, as a result. So, continuing with our definitions, we now have, once fine arts came along, we began to develop art theories. Art theory answers the question, what is art? What is the purpose of art? Aesthetics, on the other hand, answers the question of, now that we know what art can be, is this good art? Does this satisfy the aesthetic to be considered a good work of art? So we need the art theory to define what art is, and then we can use aesthetics as a measurement of the quality of art. Here are the major art theories in the West since the Greeks, 500 BC. We have Plato, who defined art, defined the purpose of art, defined this art theory of realism, that art should represent reality. This is how we can communicate to each other, across time and across space, that the better, more realistic an art representation is, the more truthful it is, and therefore the more beautiful it is. That if it's true, it is also beautiful. His student Aristotle went a little further and said, okay, to be beautiful, the work of art must also have an appearance of order or harmony or symmetry, as well as being functional, meaning a true representation of reality for humans to show each other. So art had a responsibility of communication in this way. But once photography was invented, art no longer had to be true, accurate representations of our reality to each other. Art was then freed to communicate emotions and expressions. So the purpose of art at that time became to embody and stimulate emotion, often through the use of metaphor. There was a side invention at that time called cognitivism, and this is the idea that art can teach. So we had a very famous education philosopher in the 1950s, Dewey, who said that an aesthetic experience can give meaning and value in the realm of teaching, and this is something that we can consider as we instruct our students, for example. In the 1900s, abstract art came along. Abstract art focuses on it focuses on the form, meaning the line, the shape, the curve, color, texture. This is where we get abstract art, which could be simply a white canvas on a wall. That was considered the embodiment of the concept of white, and that this was a valid type of artistic expression. Then we come to our more recent era, which is postmodernism, with the idea that art and aesthetics cannot be separated from the entire context of our human world, that there are social, ethical, political considerations. No theory, none of these theories are absolute, and the context of art is what's really important. So these are kind of the four major art theories. I got this out of reading a very nice text by Terry Barrett, which, the title of which is, "Why is that art?" Because many of you maybe have this experience. You go to see a work of modern art, and you look at it and you say, my child could do better than that. That's just, what is that? So understanding this concept, these art theories, I think, helps us understand what the intention is and what the art is actually trying to communicate. So I want to give you my theory of art, which is based in my reality, postmodernism to some extent, that anything that humans do can be art. I want to go back to the original definition of the word, that art just means anything that humans can do. So art can be the embodiment, the instantiation, the creation or execution of an extraordinary vision. If you have an idea and you make that happen, you make it so, that can be considered a work of art. Mundane or routine activities, they don't make the cut. Okay, so I go over here and I just put that in there. That's just routine, mundane. That's not a work of art. But if I have a vision for how to do it in some ideal or perfected way, I'm going to go and I'm going to remove my mask and look at it. That could be, I'm not saying it is, it could be considered a work of art because it's having a vision of something extraordinary and making it happen. So in this way, we can think about how anything that we or our students do could be raised to the level of art. Mathematics, everyone has heard of the elegant equation, right? The beauty of mathematics, because that's considered the elevation of not routine or mundane mathematics, but if it's beautifully done, that could be considered a work of art. Similarly, I will show you a lot of examples from physics that are, I think you will agree, are amazing works of art from my students and others. Have you ever had a meal that you thought was a work of art? Someone has cooked or created a particular dish which is just amazing. Yes? Okay. I hope. And sports, you may think of a particular athlete and the incredible, the execution of their vision. They have trained so hard and what they do is just amazing. That would be considered a work of art in this theory. I also want to point out that means having this kind of a definition means that art is not a luxury. It's not something to be tacked on at the end. It's not a little external decoration. And it is actually very fundamental to everything we do as humans. And it's important. It gives meaning to what we do as humans. This is a quote from one of my students who I was not able to give such good words, but the student really spoke to me in this way, saying that art and aesthetics give meaning to our lives and are actually crucial for explaining or getting through all the difficulty, racism, wars, and pressures of the world. That art makes it possible for us to get through all the bad stuff. There was a famous designer whose name I can't recall right now, but he said that because he made all of these beautiful things and it seemed unimportant to him. It seemed that, with all the terrible things in the world, he felt ashamed to be concentrating on aesthetics. But I think he was wrong because it's the aesthetics, having any beauty in our lives when everything else is terrible, this is what makes life meaningful. This is what makes it worthwhile. And so I want to recognize the importance that art and aesthetics have in our everyday lives, that it gives meaning. So that's what art is, the purpose of art. We can now talk about definitions of aesthetics. The formal definition that you get from Wikipedia, for example, is that it is the study of beauty, whatever that may mean to you, whatever you may believe beauty is, that aesthetics is the study of that. But I also like to use it as this yardstick for art. Now that we know what art is, we can judge something on the basis of an aesthetic. Does this artifact satisfy an aesthetic? If so, that makes it good art. It's also used now in psychology as a measure of affect, and affect is what psychologists call emotion. Right? Emotion is too ill-defined of a word for them, so they call it affect. And a psychological measure of affect is mental processes that are involved in our evaluation of something. Okay? So on one end, we might, of this spectrum that aesthetic represents, on one end, it might be, that's wonderful, I love that. So for example, if evaluating the aesthetics of a food, it would taste wonderful, we would say, yum. All right, that's our expression for, oh, that's delicious, I love that, yum. And on the other end, we have, yuck, bleh, that tastes terrible. So that is the kind of a spectrum that aesthetics can be used as a measurement of. Finally, if you talk to artists, they will describe aesthetics as a set of guidelines or design rules. So if you look at a painting by Jackson Pollock, you can immediately recognize his aesthetic, the style and the technique, and so these become like design guidelines. Are there questions so far? We'll have a chance to discuss here in a moment. So, after fine arts was invented and STEM topics were separated from art and fine arts and liberal arts, photography came along and freed the arts. We have expressionism, communication of feeling, and actually eliciting emotions become the goal, the purpose of art. And the stronger and more clearly that can be done, the better the artwork is. So now when we talk about art, it is mostly fine art for aesthetic purposes. On the other hand, in science and in STEM topics, we prize objectivity, right? Emotions can be dangerous because they can bias our work. They can bias our decisions when we're doing science. And so emotions are dangerous, and therefore aesthetics have no role, no value, no purpose. So we end up training our students, certainly in the United States in engineering, we train them exclusively to think about functional specifications, time and how much money it's going to cost to make this thing, and how to improve efficiency and safety, and very, very functional ideas. Aesthetics have no role. So, I think this is a problem. This goes back to C.P. Snow in 1959 in London. He gave a very influential lecture and then wrote a paper as well. And he recognized that our education system had split into these two separate tracks. On one side, we have the students trained in STEM topics where they're not supposed to involve any emotion in their work at all. And on the other side, we have arts and humanities. And now these two different types of students have difficulty talking to each other. And out in society, we have difficulty recognizing the value across the divide because of our training. So that's why we're all here today. And so listening to the translation of the introduction, I feel like you already agree with what I'm saying here, that bridging this gap, bridging this divide is really important for us to grow as a society right now. So that's why we're here today, to talk about how we can do that. But my perspective is all from the United States. So I would like you to form a small discussion group with the people around you. The picture that I've shown you so far about definitions of art and aesthetics and how our society is divided, is it the same here as what I was describing that we have in the United States and in Europe? So if you would be so gracious as to talk to people near you for a few minutes, what are the similarities and differences you think might exist here?
所以因为建筑是建筑比较包含结构，然后这种酸性，所以它
I think we have a lot of agreement in the room that this is a problem, and that the problems that are here in Taiwan are very similar to those in other parts of the world. I did not hear any discussions of how it's different here. Although at breakfast I learned from Professor that engineering students here are actually required to take some classes in arts. And during the introduction I heard that there are specific courses in sciences for students, and then others for art, but there's not a lot of blending of the two. So I will propose that we can use aesthetics as a bridge, that there are aesthetics in science and engineering, as well as in art, and that this we can use to bridge this gap between the approaches of the two cultures. Because aesthetics can be a valid motivation for doing science. If you look back at some of the great scientists, they were motivated not necessarily by the utility or the importance of what they were studying, but because it was fascinating and it was interesting and they thought it was beautiful. And that was why they studied it. Leonardo da Vinci is a great example of that, as an artist and as a scientist. It was all integrated. So it can give pleasure and it can drive intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you are personally motivated to do something, not because someone is paying you. Not because someone is paying you money or giving you a grade. Okay? Our students are highly motivated by extrinsic motivation. They'll do anything for a grade. They are trained like racehorses to get points, right? And we've seen that certainly in STEM topics, maybe not as much in social science. You can tell me if it's different. But that's extrinsic motivation. What we want is intrinsic motivation, because that can lead to them continuing their studies throughout their lives. And I also heard that in the introduction, that this is something that we want students to be able to take their knowledge outside the classroom and use it to inform the rest of their lives. And so intrinsic motivation can do that, and aesthetics can generate intrinsic motivation. So I propose this hypothesis to you that creating art, doing things for aesthetic reasons, is possible and beneficial for all humans, that we all need this form of expression. Similarly, for students in the social sciences and humanities and arts, applying the discipline of science will improve their practice as professionals. Being able to document what they've done, being able to iterate and gradually improve whatever it is that they're working on. Rewriting a paper, for example, is an example of that kind of iterative discipline that forms the foundation of a scientific approach. They're the same. So, I believe that aesthetics can be this bridge between the two cultures. So, I would like you now to think about your discipline. What might an aesthetic be? What do you love about what you do that is most important to you? What is your aesthetic in your discipline? Maybe it's a spectrum. There's a part of it that you love and a part of it that you hate. Okay, that's also part of our definition of aesthetics. So please now again discuss and think about what is the aesthetic of your discipline. What is the best, most beautiful part of it, the part that you want to share with your students perhaps? So I heard an example of a teacher who finds inspiring students think of beauty when she's able to do that. I heard from a theater person who can describe an aesthetic for a performance as being a great performance down to a terrible performance. We've all seen that. And for someone who works on food for the elderly, healthy and delicious food at one end down to, terrible, institutional, inexpensive food that no one wants to eat. So wonderful examples of aesthetics in everything that we do. Now I'd like to show you some examples from my students and from my discipline I teach fluid mechanics. This is my primary area. So this is the science and engineering of gases and liquids. Okay? Our most famous gases and liquids are air and water, but they are transparent. We can't really see the physics. We can't see what's going on inside. But if it can be visualized, then it can be seen to be very beautiful. Or there's other aesthetics as well, so I'll show you some examples from that. So I teach two classes now. One is a course focused on flow visualization, making these physics visible. And I also teach a course in design, because I am a mechanical engineer, and fluid mechanics is part of mechanical engineering. So I teach design also, design of functional objects and systems, but I ask my mechanical engineering students to consider aesthetics in their design. And this is generally a very new experience for them. They may have had a course in fine art, sculpture, or photography or something, but actually applying an aesthetic to functional engineering design is unusual for them. So I'll show you some examples of what they do. I put together mixed teams of students, and their goal is to make aesthetic works, make works of art in their discipline. I'll first show you some examples from flow visualization where the physics are just plain old beautiful, and from any perspective of any of the art theories. Aesthetics of design, students can make anything they want, which is also a radical idea for engineers. They're always told to solve problems, to solve someone else's problems. And if that's all you do in your life, that could be very tiring, I think. So by adding aesthetics into their work, it can become more meaningful and more joyful for them, no matter what they're doing. So I tell them to just make anything they want and make it aesthetic. So I'll tell you a little bit about the flow visualization course structure, how I bring the aesthetics into this very technical field of visualizing physics in gases and liquids for aesthetic purposes and for science purposes as well. So I make teams of mixed students. This is an elective course, so part graduate students, part undergraduate students. And I try to bring in students who are not just mechanical engineers. At least 1/3 students might be from the arts, and we now have a new program in my university which is technology, arts, and media. So these are students who are being trained in creating human-computer interfaces, beautiful websites, beautiful functional websites, different kinds of interaction with robots, perhaps, different kinds of technology interactions keeping the human interaction part very prominent. So they're very interested in the aesthetics as well. I spend a fair amount of time lecturing, 2 to 3 hours a week, and students do 6 assignments. I don't think we need to talk about the details there. I spent too long on that yesterday. So, the students are free to choose. This is something that I found to be very important, is giving students as much choice as possible in what they do. This improves that intrinsic motivation. They're doing it because they want to, not because I'm giving them points or forcing them to do it. And then I ask them to write detailed reports. So they make their work of art, and then depending on whether they're an engineering student or an art student, the engineering students have to talk, to learn about the science of what they're seeing. They have to talk about the physics. They have to give a very detailed description of how their work was done so that it could be repeated. The art students, when taking an art class, they may never have been asked to actually write about what their intention was, to actually write and document their techniques. So this is something that I ask the art students to do, to apply the discipline of science to their work. I lecture on photographic techniques, how light interacts with matter to make things visible to the human eyes. We talk about details of photography, such as exposure and resolution, a little bit of composition, how digital technology works. These are the tools that the students need in order to achieve their goals. Yeah, today's cameras are amazing. You know, your cell phone can take just amazing pictures, even really good macro pictures. But unless you know how to control what it's doing, you cannot necessarily achieve your goals. So we talk about that, about knowing the tools of your discipline well enough to achieve what you're trying to do. I talk about the physics of flow visualization techniques. So we can add dye or particles to a flow so that we can see what it's doing. We can use some of the physics of fluids in how it interacts with light, how the index of refraction changes and bends light. If you've been to a swimming pool in the sun, you can see on the bottom of the swimming pool a wonderful network of lines of light, correct? Yes, you've all experienced it. These are called caustics, and it's caused by concentration of parallel sunlight into areas of brightness and darkness. And so we talk about that type of using the index of refraction to show us what the physics are. We talk about fluid phenomena, how does sight work properly, scaling laws, that's kind of a thing in fluid mechanics. We talk about the physics of clouds. Students are expected to take 2 images of clouds through the semester. And we talk about how what we see in the clouds tells us the physics of the atmosphere. Anytime you see a cloud, it is because the air in the cloud is moving upwards. Anytime air is moving downward, if there was water droplets in the clouds, they would evaporate. So anytime you see a cloud, it's because the air is going up. And so we talk about that kind of physics and what happens to the temperature and the heat energy and so on, and why some clouds are puffy and why some clouds are flat, all of those physics that we can see in the clouds every day. And my favorite topic is vorticity, spinning fluid. We spend a lot of time on critique, getting students to analyze each other's work. Critique means bringing out the strengths of a work as well as what is maybe not working as well. But instead of making a criticism, I try to train students to ask questions. Why was it done like that? This is a form of critique that in the West we identify with our work. All right, if you make a critical comment about my work, you are attacking me. All right, and I won't hear that. I will turn off. I won't hear what you're saying. But if critique is done properly rather than criticism, then I'm more willing. I'm able to hear what you're saying. So we talk about critique, and while the students' images are being critiqued, I tell them a lot about the physics of what they're seeing in their images. And this then gives them the resources they need to write a good report. And then there's a few other lectures, maybe not so important during the class. Okay. What's unusual about this is that when I started this, I think this was the first course focused entirely on flow visualization. Since then, I have several colleagues around the United States who have begun to offer similar courses or parts of the class. What I think is also unique is that the art students are expected to be scientists. There have been other courses, and you may know of some here as well, where you put art students together with engineering students and you tell them to do a project together, but the art students do the art part, and the engineering students do the engineering part, and yeah, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But by asking each student to cross the divide, asking the artists to be scientists, asking the engineers to be artists, this is where I think the power of the class comes out. grade them on how good their art is. And instead, they have to complete their assignments. They have to complete all of their images or videos, and they have to write their reports. And then I publish everything on a very high visibility website. If you Google flow visualization, you will find flowviz.org, which is where my students' work is published. That will be a top Google results. So when the students leave the university and they go out to find their first job or second job or third job, anytime someone Googles their name, their work in this class comes up. So they should be, I'm not sure they are, but they should be highly motivated to produce good work because it will become part of their permanent professional online identity. So this gives authentic meaning to their work. It's not just, for a grade. They treat work that they do for a grade while they're in school as, a game. It's just a game to get points. But this becomes very meaningful to them. Again, I give them the freedom to develop their own experiments. I don't tell them what kind of fluids to use, except it should not be toxic or dangerous. Although they love combustion, they love burning things. They use things in their kitchen, and I have learned a tremendous amount of fluid physics from what my students bring in. When I started this work, my background was in a particular type of flow, and now I know so much more about everything else. So I've learned a tremendous amount from my students. Although not all the properties are unknown, sometimes they work with proprietary fluids like, do you have WD-40 here? It's a type of lubricant, okay? And the formula is secret, so you never know. Or if you're working with a foodstuff, the properties are quite variable and difficult to look up and do analysis on. So that is something that is helpful for the students to recognize, actually, that you can't look everything up in a table. So the impact of this has been that students want to take this class. Unlike many of our courses, especially our required courses, students really want to take it. I always have a long wait list for my class. And what's more important to me as a teacher is the aesthetics of teaching, having changed my students' lives. This, to me, is the highest aesthetic that a teacher can hope for, to really have a lasting impact on a student. So when they write to me after years saying, oh, Professor Hertzberg, I saw this wonderful type of wave on the beach the other day, and it made me think of you. Or I saw this amazing type of formation in my miso soup. I realized that I was seeing convection rolls, and that made me think of your class. That is what I want for all of my classes. I want my students to take what they've learned in my class and see it in the outside world. When I teach my regular fluid mechanics course, how to calculate pressure drop in a pipe, they never write to me about that. Never. The things that they cite as important are the fact that they are allowed, encouraged to consider aesthetics, not just the importance or the utility of what they're doing, that they have the freedom to choose the physics to study, that I expect them to be creative. In many of our classes, we give them very, very tightly constrained problems to solve. When you have an engineering textbook and there's problems in the textbook, everything you need to solve that problem is in the chapter where the problem is, right? And so there's no creativity needed. You grab the correct equation, you plug in the values, you plug and chug. No creativity. But in this class, they're expected to be creative. And they actually really enjoy learning about photography. This is, a big part of today's world. The result is that students come out, and I have changed the way they see the world. They see fluid physics everywhere. That's what I want for all my classes. So, now I'm going to show you some aesthetics. How are we doing on time? How How long? When am I supposed to stop? Half hour, okay, we'll go kind of fast here. So after seeing many submissions of student work, I have come up with 4 different type of aesthetics that I've seen in the fluid physics, just in this one narrow area of science. There's obviously the aesthetics of beauty. So this is actually a type of wax melting in a pot, so that you can then take a bottle of your favorite salad dressing and seal it with bottle wax. So this is an image of bottle wax melting, and I think you will agree this is beautiful. It's got form and color and texture, all of the things that are needed in a beautiful work of art. You have the circle in the square, lovely, lovely graceful lines are seen. So that's one example. This is, I love a strong diagonal in an image. I love the composition of this image. And this is actually what's called a Rubens tube. So you have a tube, maybe this much in diameter. You fill it with propane, a gaseous fuel, and you light the tube. There's holes, so the gas is coming out along an array. And where the pressure is high, the flames are tall. Where the pressure is low, the flames are short. And if you put an acoustic signal, like from a loudspeaker, you can see the pressure waves in the tube. So if you use a pure tone, then you get a very nice regular distribution of pressures. But students love music, so they just play music at it, and then you get dancing flames. Here is an example from professional artists. This is actually kind of an advertisement for the kind of work that they do. And I think you will agree this is pretty beautiful. There is music. Let me see if I can get it today. Is there? Maybe, maybe not. Well, do I have one? Yeah, I think I should have checked it. Nope. Okay. So no music, that's fine. But with a high-speed camera, just ink and water can be amazing. So this is a particular type of instability that we talk about. This is the Rayleigh-Taylor instability. So there's a lot of fluid physics here as well, but it is just amazing to watch. So those are kind of the aesthetics of beauty in fluid mechanics. Gases and liquids can be very beautiful, but there's another aesthetic which is all about control, human control over tremendous energy or precision. So here is the launch of the space shuttle. So you can see the tremendous power in the flow of the rocket exhaust. And it's really kind of awesome in a lot of ways. There's also precision in this work by Chai-Guo Chang. I think I said that right. Yeah. And yesterday, when I showed this, they said, oh, this must have been in Beijing. But no, it was here in Taipei. Did anyone see this, the Centennial fireworks in 2011? No? Okay, well, they're fantastic. There was fireworks going off of the top of Taipei 101. And then this was at a waterfront park. I'm sorry, there was music that goes along with it. But this is a huge display. Look at the precision of the timing. So all of the initial rockets were radio controlled, and then the payload goes up, and there's radio actuators in each little piece of the fireworks. And so the secondary explosions were also timed very precisely to create this amazing display. So, to me, this represents power and control. Here's another example. This is a young artist in the United States who does amazing things with vape. Is vape a thing here? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so he creates his own devices for vape, and this is what he can do with it. He can make vortex rings. So this fluid phenomena, these vortex rings, is one of my favorite things to study in fluid mechanics. And he can do amazing things that I cannot recreate in a laboratory, but that he can do just from studying and exerting the power over his creations. He just split a vortex ring. Let's see, he's going to do what's called the leapfrog, where he can make one vortex ring go inside of another. All right, and so now they're going to exchange places. This is called leapfrog. Boom. Okay, and then this one wraps around it. It's just amazing what he can do. And then he excites an asymmetry. So instead of just a uniform circular ring, he makes this happen, and then because of the physics of vortex rings, it oscillates, and you get out of plane motion. There he's gotten it to split, so vortex reconnection is very much a studied mathematical phenomenon, but the color is fake. You can't actually do that in real life. So humans are also fascinated by the aesthetics of destruction. Everyone perhaps has watched natural disasters on YouTube and on television. It's amazing to watch volcanoes and tsunami and avalanches and landslides. This is granular flow, so it's considered part of fluid mechanics. Tornadoes are amazing. Wildland fires are also amazing. The physics of how things burn is astonishing, but there's a little bit of, I feel kind of guilty watching destruction, personally. You know, often someone's home is burning, and that's a terrible loss for them. There may be loss of life, but at the same time, we humans have some pleasure in watching the amazing force of nature. Many of these are natural disasters that humans have no control over. We also create disasters ourselves in the form of explosions. The military is very good at creating destruction, right? But there are also unintentional explosions, such as when you have a rocket launch that fails, kaboom. That's, again, fascinating to watch. There's a phenomenon called a BLEVE. So I am a volunteer firefighter. I live outside of town, and when there's a fire, we get in the fire truck and put in the pump and spray water. If someone has a car accident, we go and we help the injured people out of the car, and we put them in the ambulance. So this is often done by volunteers. Only in large cities do we have paid firefighters. So I'm a volunteer firefighter, and this is a phenomenon that we are very frightened of. In my area, there's no delivery of natural gas, and instead people heat their homes with propane, which is a fuel that is under pressure, and it's liquid. Okay, and then we take the vapor into the house and we use it for heating and for cooking and so on. So every home has tanks, maybe this long, maybe this tall, full of fuel. If a fire comes up to the outside of the tank, we can get a BLEVE. A BLEVE is a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. So this is a normal situation. When there is flame impinging, touching the tank where the liquid is, the liquid absorbs the heat. Okay? and eventually gets hot enough to boil. So we have now boiling liquid in here, but it's okay because the energy is transferred away from the wall, and the wall stays at the temperature of the liquid. So long as the liquid is not too hot, that's fine. But if the flame touches the vapor space, then the temperature can go very high, so that we now have a hole formed in the vapor space. Above the vapor space, the wall fails, vapor comes out. That's the boiling liquid expanding vapor, and because it's partially confined, we have what's known as a transition from deflagration to detonation. So instead of just normal flames, we have an explosion. And this is a very high-powered explosion that can happen from one of these tanks. So there's a very cheerful girl, Maggie, who loves to study. She collects YouTube videos, and she publishes these collections of YouTube videos of all kinds of explosions, including levies. So this was at a oil refinery. That's a very big explosion. From a tank of, I missed what it was. Not propane, but some other liquid fuel that happened to make a levy. Butane, that is butane. So we're going to watch it again in, yes, doing the reverse is always interesting. Okay, now we're going to watch it in slow motion. This is the tank. That's the tank that made the levy. Took off like a rocket. So, fascinating to watch this destruction. The last type of aesthetics is just weird flows. There's, depending on the specific properties of the fluid, you can get weird things happening. One of them can happen with a liquid detergent, a liquid soap, or a liquid laundry detergent, because the fluid, when it is stretched, it becomes less viscous. It becomes shear thinning. So this can happen. Sorry, there's cute music, but you don't get to hear it today. So when, here's our stream of liquid detergent, it comes down, it piles up, and then all of a sudden, it makes that. It does that. And this is called the K effect because a fluid mechanics professor went to our professional society and said, I noticed this effect and I have no idea why it's happening. So everybody wanted to answer his question, and so there was a lot of research done on why does it do that? That's just weird. So it turns out there's because it's shear thinning, the fluid that piles up becomes more stiff and it forms a little pocket. So it makes the fluid squirt out to the side. So next time you pour laundry detergent or in the shower, if you have a liquid detergent that is hitting an angled sheet, an angled surface, look for this. And students do just weird things. They take shaving cream and they put food coloring on it, very bright colors, and then he squished it through the drain from the drain plate on a shower. You know, on the floor, you take the plate up and it's got square holes, so it's just an amazing work of art, but it's weird. And our students love to experiment with alcohol and combustion. So here they are put together. Finally, students love to play with kudle. So if you take cornstarch, and what was the word for cornstarch? Okay. You mix it with water. If you hit it with your fist, it's hard like a rock. But if you touch it gently and slowly, it is liquid. Yes? Have you done this? Have you played with this? It's very common in school experiments in the United States. So I suggest you try it. Just a little bit of water inside the cornstarch. You can get this. If you put it on a loudspeaker so that it vibrates, it starts to crawl, like as if it were alive. It's very creepy to watch. So this is a time-lapse image of one of these lumps of cornstarch and water. We call it oobleck. So we can use aesthetics in education. It provides a valid motivation, and it works at many different levels of intensity. So sometimes I'll just ask students to find an example of flow visualization on the web, and then we show it in class, and we talk about it. Or we have this entire course dedicated to it. Anything in between can also work. The course works better because I believe when students are allowed to really be creative, they have a transformative experience. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about educational theory and educational psychology. And again, I want to be clear that this is from studies all done in the United States. Your culture here is different, and so your experience may be different, and I'm very interested to find out if there are similar studies here, if these results would be the same. So you may have very different experiences. So I will illustrate this with two stories, one from Mark Twain and one from Richard Feynman. Twain started out, before he became a writer, he was a riverboat pilot. And he loved the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is big, powerful, beautiful river. You can see sunlight, sunsets reflected in it. He loved the river. But after he became a pilot, he learned that, oh, that's a sandbar. If I hit that with my ship, everyone's going to die. Okay? Oh, there's a log submerged over here. And so he learned to read the river and recognize hazards. And once he did that, the river was no longer beautiful to him. It became a place of danger and stress. And he began to hate the river for this reason. So the more he learned, the less he loved his subject. Let's contrast that with Richard Feynman, famous physicist. He says, I have a friend who's an artist who says, and the artist friend says he can see more beauty in a flower than Feynman because Feynman, chops it up and does analysis, and that makes it boring, and it sucks the life out of it, and it becomes dead. But Feynman says, I can see much more about the flower than he sees. Just thinking about the cells and the complicated action, that also has a beauty. So the more Feynman knows, he finds that the science knowledge only adds to the excitement, adds to the mystery and the awe of the flower. It only adds. I don't see how it subtracts. I want my students to have the Feynman experience. I don't want them to have the Twain experience. So have you had a Twain experience where you start out learning a subject and by the time you're at the end of the semester, you hate it? Have any of you ever had that experience? Or you start out studying something and then you don't want to know anymore? Or have you had Feynman experience where the more you learn, the more you want to learn? Has your knowledge of your discipline increased your affect, your emotional response to your discipline? Does it ever spoil? Do you ever wish, I didn't want to know that? Please discuss among yourselves. So I want to put this into context. What is happening in a class where students are allowed to be creative and to create art, to create aesthetics, even in the context of a very technical discipline in my fluid mechanics class is that they have what is called a transformative experience. And so as teachers, we might recognize the transformative experience is where students finally get it. They understand, they say, ah, yes, of course. We all want that for our students. It has markers that once someone has had this transformative educational experience, their perceptions expand. So in fluid mechanics, they now see fluid mechanics everywhere. In my design class, they see design everywhere. They voluntarily apply what they've learned in the classroom outside. They not only see the physics outside, they understand it, they talk about it, they interact with it. So they apply their knowledge of the classroom outside the classroom, and they love it. It has an affective value. They appreciate the physics that they see elsewhere. So I want this for all my students, not just for flow visualization, but for everything I teach. So what are the ingredients? How do I help students to have this experience? I can't force them to have it. How do I encourage this to take place? So I started designing another class around the concept of design for engineers, because they can also expand their perceptions. They will suddenly notice that design is everywhere. Design is, in how this screen is put together. It's in how the laptop moves, and it's in what I see on the screen. Design is everywhere. I give them, again, the freedom to choose their project. They can make anything they want, anything that they know that they have time to make, that they have the resources to make, they can make it. For their first project, I ask them to upcycle, to take waste materials and make something interesting out of it. And then for their main project, create something that moves in time or space. But I want it to reflect an aesthetic. I want them to think about their personal aesthetic, their own artistic aesthetic, and put that into an artifact. I have mostly mechanical engineering students, but then I still have some students mixed in from other programs where they have a little bit more art training. This inspires the engineering students to improve their performance in aesthetics. They see what is possible and they do better at it. Similarly, the TAM students learn about technology tools from the engineering students. So I'm trying now to integrate these skills into a way that works for the students. So I'm trying to encourage them to share their expertise. And I have not yet figured out exactly the best way to do that. That is a work in progress. Anyways, they make all sorts of things. They make light fixtures, flashlights, mirrors. They make clocks, which I don't understand, because who looks at a clock anymore? They always look at their cell phones, but they love to make clocks in the class, and other things. So what I found from giving them this freedom of design and teaching them a little bit of art history, asking them to write about their aesthetics, what I found is that it's great. Students do consider engineering design to include both form and aesthetics, but also I found that I improved their identity as engineers. They thought they were better engineers at the end of this experience because I had asked them to make art. Here are some of the quotes. I don't think I have enough time to go through with it, but like I said, they felt that they were better engineers as a result of this experience. So that made me start thinking a little bit more about engineering identity. There's a lot of research going on in the United States in schools of engineering on how to help students feel like they're engineers. This is important for students who come from diverse backgrounds, Maybe there are no engineers in their families. Maybe they're the first student in their family to even go to college. Maybe they are economically disadvantaged. Maybe they are from a different race or a different identity of some sort. We want them to feel like they're engineers. If they feel like they're engineers, they will stay in our program and they will go on and be successful. So there's a certain amount of research going on in that, but at the same time, once someone decides, okay, I am an engineer, they may also feel, I am not an artist, because they have not had that experience of being an artist, about seeing how art can be important to them as engineers. And so this can increase the divide instead of making it bridged. This is another aspect of engineering education psychology that I feel needs more research. So I personally feel that I can be an engineer and an artist. I have a background in photography. I study combustion and cardiac flow. I'm a volunteer firefighter. All these things go together into my identity in my profession, my professional identity. It becomes a braid. I have things outside of the braid, my family, my husband, I dance. I have not yet figured out how to make that part of my engineering identity. Everyone has different threads in their lives. What I'm hoping is to help students have a central identity as engineers, but have additional identities that are blended in and mixed together to maintain their identity as artists as well. I would like you to maybe think about this. I don't think we have time for discussion of this right now, but think about your identity. Are you just your profession? Or are there other aspects that can be blended in as well? The last topic I want to talk about is how can we help students to maintain this identity that is blended, that contains being an engineer and being an artist. One way to do that is through what's called the mindset research. So I don't know if this is very common. It's from Carol Dweck, who found that that there are two mindsets that we can have. One is that the idea that intelligence is fixed, that your identity and that your intelligence and your abilities that you're born with, your natural talents, that does not change. You cannot change your talent, is the fixed mindset. The growth mindset is that, you know, even if I start out and I don't know anything about photography, I can become a good photographer if I work at it. I can become better at mathematics if I work at it. I can become better at remembering names and faces if I work at it. That's my personal trouble. So the idea that you can grow your intelligence through work, the idea that you can make yourself better. The thing is that if you believe you have a fixed mindset, then that is true. If you believe you cannot get better at something, you never will get better at it, right? But if you believe that if you work at something, you can get better, that is also true. And the good thing is that you can change your beliefs from fixed mindset to growth mindset. So this is something that we talk about with our students. The goal is to have students believe that even though they may have a strong identity as an engineer, they can still be artists and bridge that divide. So, again, we don't have time for discussion, I'm sorry, but what is your mindset? Do you believe that intelligence is fixed, or can you get smarter at something through working at it? Have you seen students, perhaps, who start out having a lot of trouble, but they eventually improve? And similarly, You know, have you seen do you believe that students who don't seem to have any talent, can they still benefit from being helped from your time? Or should you not spend time on students who, you know, they're never going to be an engineer, sorry. What do you think? So in conclusion, why teach art and engineering? It can lead to this transformative experience. It can lead to lifelong learning. It can provide value and meaning to anything that we do as humans. It can enhance a broadened identity to help students be more than just engineers. And finally, I believe it can bridge the gap between the cultures. Thank you. So I invite you to look at the course websites for my 2 classes and see what amazing work boring engineering students can do. And I want to acknowledge my National Science Foundation that helped me get started with this work. And with that, I'm willing to take questions. If there are no questions, let's go back to those discussion ideas. Do you have a blended identity? Okay, here we go.
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned that some of your students' backgrounds, including art and media students, can you say something about what they thought about your class? Did they feel kind of marginalized since they knew very little about engineering or your specialty? Okay, so
Well,
what was the student outcomes for you?
what I have observed is that the students who come in with arts and media training are much better at critique than my students, than the engineering students. Engineering students are very reluctant to criticize each other in class, but the arts and media students are very used to this. And so they can do the critique in a very helpful way. It's gotten better since I now use a very structured critique approach. But really, in this way, the arts and media students, I don't think that they feel marginalized. I have not surveyed them, I have not analyzed my survey results for them separately yet. So I can't answer based on evidence. But they, like I said, they are more assertive in class than the engineering students. And the engineering students, I think, are impressed with the level of work that the art students produce, and they raise their game. They improve in response to the beautiful work that the artists produce. So I think by valuing the aesthetics in the class, they see the value of each other's backgrounds.
My question is similar to the previous one. In your first flow visualization course, you say the art students are expected to be the scientists in this course. And what did you do or your other students do to help them to achieve such things? For example, you mentioned about the document or experiment. How do the course design to help them to achieve the things they are not familiar with? Thank you.
So I put them on teams so that they can each contribute based on their backgrounds. So the art students may help the engineer learn how to edit a video. And the engineering students may say, please come to my research lab, we can work together and look at this liquid crystal. So the engineering students try to explain the physics to the art students. I allow them to share content. So maybe the engineering student writes a description, but the art student has to incorporate that in their report and describe their artistic intent as well. So in this way, I try to help them to gain this experience from both sides. It's an elective class, and it's a popular class. So at the beginning of the semester, I try to make my expectations very clear so that if the art student comes in and they find out that they're expected to write these descriptions, and they don't want to do that, they don't have to take the class. And sometimes I lose students for that reason. But I only want students who are willing to have this experience.
Okay, I'm interested about why identity is so important. Because if I'm an engineer, maybe I can say I'm an engineer and I can do some artworks. I don't want to say I'm the artist. So my question is why identity is so important in your mind?
As I mentioned, engineering identity, there's a lot of research going on right now because we want to have diverse student populations. That this will strengthen our profession. We will have more students who will come and want to be engineers if they know, for example, that their identity as an artist, perhaps they have already come in with an identity as an artist, that we're not going to ask them to leave that behind. And I think that growing this identity, the idea that you can be more than just focused on one thing, I think that makes for healthier humans, actually. And as I said, I want them to have this identity as an artist, to not just say, oh, I'm an engineer and I do a little art on the side, but to really make that part of who they are. I think that will bring meaning to their lives as engineers.
Super interesting talk, and I feel a lot part of your theory and talk. I'm sorry. It's related to education theory. I have a question about student taking your course. What's the gender ratio?
When I first taught flow visualization, I had an unusually large number of women. In mechanical engineering, we only have maybe 12% women students. But the first time I taught it, I had a lot more women. But then it became a very popular course, and then the demographics, because of when students registered, I ended up only with the normal percentage. I believe if I had room in the class for everyone who wants to take it, that it would be more skewed towards women. But I don't know. I don't have the data. Yeah.
Thank you.
Simply because part of it is because of identity. I try to welcome students with different identities into the class. Yes.
Okay, I have a question about the definition of the aesthetic. So maybe from the two disciplines, for example, the engineer, what their definition about the aesthetic? Because when they work together, maybe they are not agree with the definition of the aesthetic. Maybe for the engineer, they think this is beauty, but for the art discipline, they will think, no, this is not the beauty. So, based on your experience, have you how to address with this issue when they work together? How they can make the same definition about the aesthetic?
Well, they don't make the same definitions. The idea of an aesthetic is very unique to each person. And each student makes their own artwork. So they may work together, they may all share, they may all work together on a water tank experiment, a flume. But each student is supposed to make their own image using the same setup if they want to share the setup. And so that way they can express their own aesthetic. And I encourage them to be individual in that way. So if a student, if a student has an aesthetic that no one else agrees with, in my design class once, a student made an image of scissors, and he illustrated it with a little bit of his blood. Okay, very strange aesthetic. The other students asked him questions about it, but the student had a very clear idea of what he was trying to achieve and was able to talk about it and help the other students see what he was trying to get at. And so that made it a valid aesthetic.
May I ask a second question? I'm sorry. I think perhaps I misunderstood something, but I think you mostly talk about the first course, right?
Yes.
Course. And since I'm a literature person, so I'd like to know whether a literature person can also offer a course like the second one, Aesthetics of Design.
Ah.
Did you offer it all by yourself?
I offer the design course all by myself, yes. I think in literature, this would be useful in the context of a creative writing class.
But what if I would like to allow my students to have this chance to know more about technology and science and engineering? Do I have to co-offer the course? Or any experience or examples that you know?
I have a colleague who co-taught a class with, who was it? I can't remember now what discipline, but the focus of the class was on art to illustrate environmental issues, for example. And so having two professors teach a class is certainly a valid approach. As a literature professor, you may not feel comfortable telling students to go and use a 3D printer, and you may need assistance with that aspect of it. But at the same time, I don't know how to use a 3D printer, even though I teach design, because my students can go and take short workshops for that particular tool and gain the expertise they need outside of class. So there may be these kinds of resources as well. When I first developed my flow visualization class, I taught it together with a photography professor. But then because of the economics of the school, he was not able to continue teaching it with me, and so I have been doing it on my own since then. But teaching together was a wonderful way to begin and to illustrate to our students how to value contributions from across the divide and to take on the skills of the other side.
Sorry, can you say a little bit more about the second course, Aesthetics of Design? So,
in the Aesthetics of Design course, when I started, I did not know very much about art history or about design movements, but in collecting resources for my students, I ended up focusing on, okay, let's talk about the last 100 years of design movements. What are the major design movements? What's the difference between Art Nouveau and Art Deco, and how did that become modernism? So I did my own reading in this area, and then present these as potential aesthetics to my students. But actually, what I found more useful than me telling my students about this is I create opportunities in class. So I have a game that we play. I have a container with the names of objects, like an umbrella, or a baby stroller, or a table and chairs. And then I have another basket with different aesthetics in it. So the, do you have hipsters here? The hipster aesthetic? Young men with beards? No? Okay. So there's there's Art Nouveau. So design an Art Nouveau umbrella. Okay? And so I tell them to put them together randomly, and they don't know all of the aesthetics that are possible. They don't know the brutalist aesthetic. They don't know the difference between that and Art Deco. So they have to do short research online in class, and then create a drawing of their object cast into that aesthetic. And this gets them to discover these different aesthetics and learn about them and read about them, and then apply them immediately in class. And then again, I publish their images. So this is an approach that doesn't require expertise necessarily on my part, and encourages the students to create their own knowledge, which, as all the educators in the room know, that's the best way to do it. Did I answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Maybe one last question? Anyone?
Okay? Well, thank you very much.